Welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm here to create a laboratory for you all, and the better job I do, the more invisible I will become. And what I want to do with you all today is to create a master class in the art of gathering. And so what that really means is the first half, I'll be actually building community and, in a way, hosting you all. And in the second half, we're going to reverse engineer what I did from the perspective of a host or an organizer based on the principles of gatherings and really bringing in your content and your context into this. So I want to set up a couple of ground rules just up front. The first is, except for me, no phones. I get privilege for a facilitator's choice. If you're taking notes on your phones, that's fine, but otherwise just to kind of be here and trust that you'll get the information that you need from this session afterwards. The second is I'm going to be having you move around in different ways if it feels good to you, if it's accessible to you. If you don't want to, that's also fine. So giving you permission to listen to my prompts or to not. And then the third is confidentiality. So I'm not sure what you all have been doing over the last day and a half, but for my session, what I like to do is Chatham House rules. I can never say that word right, which basically means you're free and encouraged to talk about the experience, to share what you heard from people, but to not to attribute anything specific to a person, if that makes sense. So we're creating a safe space together, but also one that we can learn from each other, because the whole point of this is to learn. So with that, I invite you to stand up if it's available to you. Post-lunch. And if you're not standing up, to just put your feet fully on the ground or feel your legs on the ground. And for everybody who's standing up, to take a couple of deep breaths. And if it's available to you, if you'd like to close your eyes or to look down on the floor, just to kind of go within for a second and take a couple of breaths, breathing in through your nose and exhale through your mouth. And just let your hands hang by your side. Take a couple more breaths. I got the afternoon slot post-lunch. And as you do, breathe and feel the soles of your feet. Just kind of literally dig into the ground. So studies show that 80 to 90% of the information we receive about movement and space comes from the nerves on the soles of our feet. And so as you're physically feeling the ground, you're literally grounding. It's not only for the free spirits, it's also scientific. And as you do, to take a couple of deep breaths and just think about a moment in one of your meetups where you felt, this is why I do this. And as you're ready, open your eyes. And continue to breathe. And as you do, look around. Just see who's here. You can't build a community if you don't know who's in it. And as you look around, if you dare make eye contact, you can acknowledge the person. And just notice what's happening to your breath. Are you holding your breath? Or are you continuing to breathe? So just practice a little bit. Breathe, and see if you can both see and breathe at the same time. It's not easy. Can you see and breathe at the same time? Can you be and do at the same time? So what I'm going to be doing is a number of different exercises with you, and at the same time, I'm going to be pausing and talking about what I'm doing. And I want you to be thinking about this from the perspective both of being in this as a full participant of this tribe of 150, as well as you as an organizer and as a host of your own communities. Right now, as I'm sitting here talking, this is the first 5% of the time I have with you. This is my opening. And right now, all of you are thinking a lot of different things. Some of you are smiling and being like, oh man, this is my jam. Other of you are looking for the exit. Some of you are looking down, some of you are looking up, some of you are physically uncomfortable, some of you may be deeply physically comfortable. And this is always happening when you're the host and your guests are coming in. In the first 5% of any interaction, no matter what people are saying, they're watching the physical norms. Do I belong here? Do I want to be here? Do I think that these are my people, or do I want to leave? Is this something that I'm willing to give 30 more seconds to, or am I out the door? And as a host, you always have 30 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes to buy the next 5 minutes. And the reason why a meetup and a group is dynamic and fascinating is because anything can happen at any moment, okay? So I'm going to start doing a series of prompts because I want you all to build community, and I want to give you a challenge to see if by the end of these 2 hours, you know at least half of the people's names in here. If you can do 150, that's great. It's the law of the tribe, which is Dunbar's number. It is absolutely possible to know 150 names, maybe not in 2 hours. So I'm going to say a prompt, and as I do, I'm going to invite you to step in. So let's see. I've never done this actually with 150 people in rows. So this is going to be an experiment. But let's start and we'll see. So if I'm going to say a prompt, if it's true for you, I want to invite you to step in the circle and everyone else can step back. If you don't want to physically move and it's true for you, put your 2 hands up, okay? So if you've been a meetup organizer for 10 or more years, come in or put your hands fully up and come fully in. Come stand with me. I won't bite. Amazing. Welcome. Okay, and if you could just say your name and your meetup group and how many years the first meetup you started, either the year or how many years ago.
My name is Geraldine, and I took over a group 10 years ago. It was called Knitting Around New York, and we still meet twice a month, every month, and we just sit down, hang out, chit-chat, and knit together.
Amazing. Thank you. Welcome, Geraldine. So just your name, the year, and the name of the group.
All right. Charity Loring, Michigan Adventures Club, 2007, 15,000 members.
Wow. Amazing.
Hi, my name is John. I run the New York City Harry Potter Meetup. It was founded in 2005. I took over in 2006. We have roughly 3,400 members.
Amazing.
My name is Jeff. I started organizing in 2008 and took over that momentum and made into my own group. So we're 147 core members.
Amazing. And the name of the group?
Kayak Adventures.
Kayak Adventures.
Kayak.
What is that?
Hiking, kayaking.
Oh, see, you learn something new. Robert.
I'm Robert. I set my group up in 2006, the London Culture Seekers group, and we've got 26,000 members.
Wow, amazing. Amazing. Okay, any other hands? Were there any hands that went up that 10 more? And Scott, when's your first meetup group?
But my oldest one was New York Tech Meetup with Dawn Barber right there, and it has like 50,000 members or something now. But my latest is a kids woodworking meetup, which New York Tech Meetup, first meetup, only Dawn showed up. Now that my new meetup group, only one person showed up.
Amazing. So. So I want to say a few things about this group. Thank you all. In any type of group, this is true for you as well in all of your meetups. These people, 10 years or more, they are your institutional memory. They're the people in your group. They are the grandmothers or grandfathers. They're the people with the stories. They're the people that knew how we used to do things when. They are the people who may be attached to the knew how we do things when. And they are also the people who carry our stories and carry the ways that we make meaning over time. So in any of your groups, whether you've been a group for 10 years, you will probably have a group or a member who's just arrived. And you've probably also had a certain percentage who've been there from the beginning. Both have deep, deep, deep value, but they bring value in a group for different reasons. Those who have been there for a long time carry our stories, and those that are new carry fresh eyes. So if you've been a meetup organizer for less than 2 years, I'd like to invite you to join into the center. Or put your hands up. Okay, so we're going to zip around, and I have a lot of prompts, so we're going to just say name and meetup group, and everybody listen to your. So I actually invite you to look out to the group, not to me, so they can see you. And we'll just start here with Alex. Just say your name and your group.
Alex, Vinyl Listening Club.
Great.
Monica, Urban Winglers over 30.
Awesome.
I actually started being event host for a bunch of different groups, but I just.
This is the most new. Great. The most recent.
Yeah.
Great.
Michael, I'll go to Victor.
And just speak up, because not everyone, I only have a mic. Yeah,
I'll go
Mike.
to Victor.
Eric, filmmakers of New Mexico.
Clara, Bike Hike Club.
Reese, Church of the Cosmos.
Stephanie, San Jose Mental and Emotional Wellness.
Victoria, the Great Lakes Hiking, Biking, and Kayaking Group. Come on over to Michigan.
Medu, International Foods and Cultures.
Ricky, AgTech Boston, the Running Valley, Boston. Sorry.
The fun over 50 liberal conversation and dining group.
Okay. Is that,
Andrew, Echo Park Book Club.
Ryan, the Brooklyn Brass Band Collective.
woo!
Michelle, share your story.
Is it good? Okay. So you all can go back. I just want to say something about fresh eyes. In each of your meetups, you're going to have a new member, maybe every time. And those people both don't know your rituals and institutional memories, but they do look and they start asking, why are they doing it this way? And if you're smart, you will listen to that question. Because by a function of time, an outsider becomes an insider the longer they stay. You actually don't really need to do much. Just by simply coming back, they're going over time, they're going to start understanding why you do the things the way you do, and they will also probably start getting attached to them. So use fresh eyes as they start coming in when they say, why do you do it like this? Why don't you do it like this? You may have a reason for it, but those are the people who can actually look at the patterns for a new way and listen to their suggestions. Okay. If you traveled from another country to get here, come into the circle. And I just want you to, we're going to see how fast we can do this, okay? So we need your name and what, number of hours on the flight or okay.
Robert, 7 hours.
Victor, 1 hour.
And Nushin, 1 hour, 30 minutes.
Okay, actually, I want you to know where you're from. So just say the city, your city of departure.
Canada.
Dawn, Vancouver, Canada, 7 hours.
Great. Just name and city.
Just name the city.
Monica, Vancouver, but 5 hours.
Ian, Toronto.
And actually, sorry, look out. So again, look, this is all building tribe. Look, see the faces, listen. Yeah, where are we?
Ian, Toronto. Andrew, Montreal, 10 hours.
Aina, Barcelona, 9 hours.
Okay, so notice what's happening. I'm giving an instruction, but I anchored in an hour. I anchored first by saying, I gave my group an instruction. I said, name in hours, right? And then and the first people did that. And I'm trying to change the system, and they're not wanting to. Right? Watch, notice this. So this is a live laboratory. I've said multiple times, no hours, but there's also an honoring of the person that goes before them. Because if the first person who changes and listens to me implicitly says the person before them was wrong. So there might actually be some empathy that they're doing and not listening. But notice and notice what they're doing. I'm going to ask one more time. And again, listen, because my guess is someone will still do it because of the operating structure that I've set up from below. Your name and your city.
Edward, Sydney, Australia.
Woo! Okay.
Jean-Christophe, Paris.
Michelle, Brisbane. Neha, New Delhi, India.
Edward from Vancouver, the loneliest city in the world. Shane from Dublin. Steve, Toronto.
Ayo, London. Nadine from Berlin. Clara, London. Sarah, London.
Lorenzo, Berlin. Andrew, Melbourne.
Robert, London.
Victor, Toronto.
Nushin, Toronto.
Okay, and see, these three people got to go twice. Okay. So this isn't necessarily a correlation, but when you think about your groups, think about who suffers the most to get to your group. Who suffers the most, who's most willing to come to your group? And that could be physical, That could be getting a babysitter versus those who don't. That could be spending money for some reason to get there or not. That could be trying to figure out how to take my very specific allergy requirements to get my food to the place to make sure that I'm not going to faint there or not. And think about there's many different forms of suffering, but suffering also builds loyalty and is binding. And to start to wake up to the ways and the obstacles people are willing to overcome to get to your meetup and to create meaning from them. Okay, so step back out. If you took, yeah, bravo. If you took the subway from your home to get here this morning, come in here, you lazy people. No, not hotel. Yeah, exactly, you got it. Okay, so quickly, look again outside. And by the way, the people on the outside, just if you're not coming in, you're still a part of this, right? So you're witnessing. The role of the witness is very powerful in the group and the role of the listener. And notice how much you're paying attention to the first half versus how difficult it is to keep that same amount of presence for the second half. And see as a host, because you're always hosting a group, if you can honor the second half of the circle as much with your attention as the first half. So we'll start with Mina. And your name and the subway line.
Mina, 2.
Lance, Q to the E.
Dawn, 6.
Sean, Q and a long walk.
Omari, 2 train.
Bree, the Long Island Railroad, and the A.
Whew.
Ryan, the L train.
John, 1 train.
Ricky, C train.
Durham, 1 train. Stuart, AC train for life.
I took that to get here.
Scott, N train.
Matt, 1 train.
Harold, R to the N.
Tom, R to the D to the C.
Ahuva, the L train.
Natasha, J, and a long walk.
Okay, thank you. So you can get back. So for those of you who are staying longer, those are the people that if you want to have the real tips and the secrets of how to spend your time here, those are your people. If you've organized more than one different type of meetup, I think that's a lot of you. Or if you've main organized more than one type of meetup, come into the circle. Or raise your hands. Yeah? Okay, let's... Okay, if you're confused by the prompt, raise your hand. Okay, so these are the people, and maybe they're not self-identifying. I think there's probably a category error here in my language. But these are the people who have had multiple experiences with different content and different types of people in the same structure of an experience. So tell me your name.
Dawn Barber. I co-founded New York Tech Meetup with Scott Heiferman. I also started CUNY Tech Meetup. And I also recently started Smart Cities Town Hall meetups.
And what have you learned in these different 3 meetups? Give us one insight at a second or third meetup that you organized where you realized, oh my gosh, this doesn't work the same way as the first one.
I would say that, well, you know, one of the constants is, I found at New York Tech Meetup is the, if you're not comfortable in the constant imbalance of leading and listening, you shouldn't really be a meetup organizer, in my humble opinion. And that skews different ways. So New York Tech Meetup, it was one way, and when I got to CUNY, I was dealing with an educational organization, and so I was just surprised at the, I guess, little maybe openness of the students, more open, and it wasn't just students, it's alumni and stuff too. But.
Okay, great. So one of the things that Dawn is talking about is the different culture, context, and norms of the communities that you're inviting in. So in one case, if it's a tech meetup, tech people tend to be, and I'm overgeneralizing here, open source, crowdsourced, flat, decentralized, lack of hierarchy, focus on interaction between groups. And so if you're not willing, what I heard you say is if you're not willing to be able to listen, you're probably not going to be a good host in that context. On the other hand, if you're doing a mentorship type of program, or if you're working with students, or you're working with a type of population that for some reason actually wants to learn, then you have a very different type of leadership style, and it creates a very different type of demand for you as an organizer. And so as you're starting to think about the community that you're gathering, to notice what is the type of power structure that works in this type of environment. Do they want you to lead, or are they wanting you to get out of the way? And when is appropriate for what context? Let's have one more example. What is your name?
Stephanie.
Stephanie, and what are your groups?
San Jose, how are we talking this? Mental and Emotional Wellness Meetup.
Uh-huh.
And I'm city organizer for San Jose, and also barbecue, breakfast, and Southern style food.
Amazing. I want to come to that one. So tell us one thing you've learned about the differences between those two, even though they're both meetups, just the mental health one and the breakfast one.
Well, the breakfast.
And speak up.
The barbecue, people want to come to eat.
Mhm.
So that's really the only reason why they're there. And to learn about, I work with my brother, and so he teaches how to grill and goes to a lot of competitions. So that's what people want to be a part of. The mental and emotional wellness group, people want to be a part of something that shows that they're getting better. Their mental illness does not define them. I have a mental illness, and I share that I actually don't let it define me. I share that I've won awards, and that helps them recognize that it's not. Well, I keep saying it doesn't define them. That there are things that they can do in life that doesn't limit them to
How they. And thank you for sharing that. And one of the things that's so interesting to me as I listen to, do you go by Stephanie?
Yes.
To Stephanie, is she has these two different groups that are radically different in approach and content, and even in title. One is barbecue. It's the most innocuous, delicious, anyone can see themselves in their category. The other one is mental and social well-being. And though it's framed as a positive, it's well-being, not illness, there's still taboo around the title inherently. You have to identify, to want to go to that, there must be some element of vulnerability to even show up. So I just want to, and you have to answer quickly, what is the difference in which the barbecue versus the mental wellness, how do people show up in the first few minutes? What do you notice about the difference, the way people come in and kind of are behaving?
They're afraid in the mental wellness. So I have to be extra, and I'm very involved in the community, and I recognize how important it is to be welcoming and to smile and show that we don't have to, again, be limited. And so a lot of people are afraid.
And how specifically do you welcome them? I mean, how do you see their fear and welcome them in?
I use my mania. I'm a bipolar disorder. I use it. It works for me. And sometimes I tell people I'm happy I have it because I smile a lot and I joke a lot, but I don't always joke with new people. I sense. I have to use my instincts to see what they feel comfortable with. I mean, if they're okay with me shaking their hand, I ask them. If they're okay with me hugging them, I hug them. But mainly, it's a lot of smiling, and I smile a lot.
Beautiful. Stephanie, I think you're, from just what you're saying, I think you're a very sophisticated gatherer. A couple of things Stephanie said that I just want to reiterate. So one of the things she said was, sometimes I shake their hands, sometimes I hug them, I always ask. So as a host, the role of consent, regardless of what you're doing, whether it's saying, do you want to come to the Haitian restaurant versus the Dominican restaurant? In some quarters of New York, that's a very controversial question. If you're talking about how you actually want to greet them, thinking about as you enter and as people come into your space, how are you getting them to buy into what it is you're offering? The second thing she said is, I use my mental disorder. I sometimes say I'm happy that I'm bipolar. And I would frame that as using her gift and using herself and using her vulnerability to allow others to step in or to not, and to give them permission as to how much they actually want to come in. So there's a facilitator I know named Lang Lim. He is local, and he always starts every session. You don't have to do this, but he always talks about giving permission and talking about permission like a swimming pool. And he says to all of his groups, I have a swimming pool here, and the swimming pool in this group works when people are starting to be vulnerable. I invite you to the swimming pool. It's your decision whether you want to wade in the shallow end or jump into the deep end. But I ask you to be here, and I ask you to join the swimming pool. you all have very different contexts of groups, and so sometimes what I'm saying, you would never, ever in a million years talk about a swimming pool in your context. Others of you, I may be giving you language and metaphors that might be very helpful to begin to name what it is you're asking people to do. So just listen as we're continuing to talk. Thank you to this group. I'm going to have you push back out. And now, with these prompts, I just want you to raise both hands. So if you've ever had no one show up to your meetup. And, okay. And just a few, give me 2 people who haven't spoken yet, who just raise your hand. Yeah, tell us your name and what did you do?
All right, my name is Eric. People didn't show up, and I kind of just took it as a game. Realistically, just move forward.
As a game? You took it as a game, or?
No, as it came.
As it came, got it.
Learn from it. What can I do to improve? How can I facilitate more communication to make sure people show up the next time?
Beautiful. So you got curious, it sounds like, also. Why aren't people showing up? And did you find out why?
Just verbiage. It was verbiage. People were confused. Just how I worded things. And so.
Can you go tell us? That's interesting. How did you word it?
There's the specific instance, I don't remember the exact wording, but it didn't make sense where we were meeting. No one showed up. It was just like we were confused at the location because it has 2 separate names.
Beautiful.
So,
Kind of like
Yeah, exactly. Kind of like today. One more person. Yeah, tell us your name and what happened. Or what did you do?
Yeah, I'm a German conversation group, and it was really good weather. And it's always on the weekends, so yeah, it actually happened once and no one went to it.
Beautiful.
And yeah, but I just kept going, and usually there's.
Beautiful. So and tell me your name again? Nadine. So one of the things Nadine's bringing up is things that are out of our control, like weather. And weather can actually be really good for groups. Bad weather can be really good for groups or really bad for groups. One of the people I interviewed for my book was a South African auctioneer. And he said rain was always the best. When it rained were the best auctions because people had nothing else to do. And so they'd make 90% of the revenue on rainy days. And so they'd often look at the weather, and if it was a rainy day versus a sunny day and they had a choice, they'd choose the rain. For others of you, was anybody trying to host a meetup during a hurricane? Raise your hand. Say it again. Was it mid-meetup? Or were you asking them to come into the top of the mountain during a hurricane?
A little column A and a little column B.
Okay.
In mild weather, it then gets 10 times worse.
10 times worse.
And you can't see your hand in front of your face. It's great fun.
Great. And has anyone ever gotten stuck in a meetup, or the meetup has gotten longer than normal because of weather? And what happened? Tell us your name.
My name is Vicki, and we were hiking a 14er in Colorado. And the entire group, with the exception of myself, it was their first time hiking a 14er. And when I calculated the time it would take us to summit and get off the mountain, I was thinking of my pace. And in Colorado, in the summer, we have lightning storms, and the last place you want to be when the lightning comes in is on top of a mountain. So that's where we were.
Sounds electric. Sorry. My husband would be like, oh, God. Okay, if you've ever had a fight break out at your meetup. Raise your hand. He laughs. Okay. So, yeah, exactly. Okay. Let's go with Edward, and then we'll move around.
What we're doing is we're using an example of Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump.
And what's your group?
So profitable marketing, and it's marketing entrepreneurship, and we're using an example where we're talking about the communication styles of Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, and not controversial at all. And one person, she got really triggered and went crazy, and then I was like, we're not endorsing a candidate, we're just talking about the communication styles, and then she just stormed and walked out.
So let me pause you. So she got really triggered, and then she went crazy. So let me pause you. What actually happened? Observe us. Like, what actually happened?
Okay. So what happened was I put up a picture of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
And how set up the room? How many people are there?
It was about 60 people.
Sitting 60 or 16?
60
Uh-huh.
in seminar style, looking at us. Had a picture of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and we're just being neutral. We're just talking about the different communication styles. Very neutral. Very neutral. Totally neutral. And,
He's like, very neutral, very neutral.
And what happened was she started getting a bit unsettled. And she sort of said, oh, look, we're not talking politically, we're just talking about communication styles of two world leaders. And she just got up and walked out, right? And it was just, and then on the way out, she was like, oh, this is terrible, Trump's terrible, we shouldn't be talking about this. And it's like, hey, don't worry, it's cool, we're not endorsing it, we're just saying this is what the facts are. And what happened was, we tried to sort of disarm her, saying, look, don't worry, we're not endorsing anyone here. But she just sort of went out, and then when she went out there, then the whole room was sort of like, oh, thank God she's gone. And everyone started laughing.
Interesting.
So she was actually causing a lot of trouble before she did that outburst. So she was already gaslighting and annoying people, and when she left, people were like, oh, yes.
Interesting. And what city was this in?
Sydney.
Interesting. She was Australian?
That's right, I think so, yeah, that's right.
Interesting. So we're so there's a lot here. We're going to come back to this. I have a scribe somewhere. So wherever the scribe is, Alex, if you can write down Edward, the Sydney moment. Okay? We're going to come back to this. A couple of things I just want to name and what's happening here. So first of all, there is a moment of what I call heat. In all of your different contexts, heat looks different for different people. In this case, this is not a political group. It goes to Scott's opening comment about Esther Dyson, that often it's interesting when politics come up in a non-political context, what do you do? And one of the things as hosts, whether or not you like conflict, the thing to know about is what is your conflict style? When conflict or heat or any type of thing that a group would typically avoid, what is your instinct? Is it your instinct to lean into it, to allow it to breathe a bit, or is your instinct to run away? And neither is good, neither is bad, but both will give you information about how you hold a group. And sometimes it's helpful. In this case, it sounds like she left and the group improved, but in some cases, you want to lean into the heat. So just the thinking about, as your own instinct, when something comes up, do you tend to fight or flight? Because it's going to disproportionately affect the way your group deals with conflict, your personal style. Give me one more example of a fight that broke up. We had a few people here. Yeah. And your name and your group.
My name is Lilia. I have Grand Little Adventures, kind of a social activity group that gets adults out and do things that they wouldn't normally do on their own. We meet weekly at a restaurant to play team trivia. And one night, a fight broke out over one of the answers. We have somebody at the table that's writing down the answers on the paper to turn into the DJ. And there was a woman at the table that she says, I know this answer. It's about Hawaii, and I lived there for 3 years. And she berated the guy into writing down her answer. Well, her answer was in fact wrong. And when the answers came back and were given out, he said something to her about shows what you know or something like that. And that got her angry, and they both stood up and started shouting at each other in the middle of the restaurant.
Beautiful, beautiful example, beautiful example. So we know Edward's conflict style. So when I listened to this example, she said, when the participant said that she knew the answer, she said, I know Hawaii. I lived there for 3 years. What is she saying there? She's an expert. What else is she saying? Authority. What else? She's talking in the present world. I can't be wrong. And I know Hawaii. I've lived there for 3 years. It's part of her identity. Say it again. Tell us more. And tell us your name. Yeah.
So where you come from, it speaks about you. And it's really powerful.
Does this work?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. When somebody identifies meaningfully with a group or a person, and then they tell that it's a part of who they are. So when you reject that, you reject them. So another powerful example of this is, I don't know if anybody's gone through a divorce. It's very important not to speak negatively about the person you're divorcing, even if you're furious and very justified, to the children, because they come from that person. And so they hear a wound at them when that's never your intention. You're just upset with the situation. But that's that's my example is
Beautiful.
you really have to be careful about how you treat people's identities, not to hurt them.
Beautiful. Thank you, Linda. Beautiful. And how many of you, as Linda shared the example of a divorce, could relate to the example, whether as a child or a participant in a divorce? So part of what you're starting to do in a meetup, in any type of group, no matter how seemingly banal the topic is you're inviting people in different ways to connect and to activate different parts of their identity. When they attribute meaning to that part of our identity, like I am Hawaiian, or at least 3 years Hawaiian, all of a sudden, when that person said you didn't know the answer, you're wrong, she heard you are not Hawaiian. Okay? And so part of this isn't, you can just be yourselves in any other context, but as an organizer, when you're hosting, to begin to think about what are the identities you're activating, and yes, to be careful, but be careful does not mean shut them down. Be careful means being aware that all of this is happening when we are in the life of groups. So you can sit, and I'm going to keep asking you to stand and everything, but I want to say a couple of things of the life of groups as you're thinking about your role as a facilitator and as a host. Yeah.
In the Hawaiian example, with that lady that went crazy, was the conflict already in her and it just came out? Like, was she already unsettled and that just triggered her? Like, is it like that? Are people already feeling a bit funny and then it just comes to the surface in that context?
I mean, I wasn't there, so I don't know. But I think my experience is we are, identity, so my mentor is a man named Hal Saunders. And he has passed away, but he was Assistant Secretary of State to Henry Kissinger and wrote the Camp David Accords. And he defines identity as all of the experiences up until this moment that define who I am. So there's two important parts of that definition. One is all of the experiences thus far, but the other is up until this moment. And so there's a part of most of our identities that is fixed. And there's a part of most of our identities that is ever expanding. And we each have different amounts that we're willing to expand or hold on to. So one of the things in a group, when you're in a dialogue group, somebody earlier, I think it may have been Bree, used the word dialogue. We're inviting you into a dialogue in our group. Where's Bree? Yeah. And part of the power of dialogue, when you can really get a group in dialogue, is you're allowing them to give them a little bit more permission to expand some part of their identity. So the first time somebody joins a meetup group, they become a meetupper. I don't even know if that's a word you use. You're like, no, they don't. But the first time, so if you're if you're in 5 meetup groups, that maybe you're a real die-hard, hardcore meetupper. But the first time somebody walks into a meetup, you may not even know it's their first meetup, they are assessing whether they want to bring this into part of their identity. And part of the beauty of groups, or city dads, you started by having this very specific example, you and Matt. Where's Matt? He was so fast to throw him under the bus. Part of what Matt and Lance did, as I heard it, was you started as relatively similar dads. Whether that's true or not. Between the two of you, there's probably an entire universe of difference. Hi, Matt. Exactly. This is like my tricky little way of saying I notice when you leave the room. No, I'm just kidding. So part of what was interesting about Matt and Lance is they started by saying, hey, we're 2 dads, this doesn't exist, we want to start city dads. And as they started to realize there's more and more and more people that could see themselves in this category, they realized they needed to expand the definition of a city dad. It's not just straight, it can also be gay. It's not just morning hours, it can also be evening hours. It's not just stay-at-home dads, it's also working dads. And what's interesting is they began to expand their identity as they realized that there's actually power in it. So the boundary around their line, at least as far as I understand it, is father. But what they define as father is expanding. So 20 years ago, they may not have had a trans organizer. But today, that trans organizer father is perhaps one of the most interesting people in the country to talk to about what fatherhood means. Because that person is both an insider and an outsider to fatherhood. And that's true for each of your groups. So I'm going to ask a few more questions. If someone has, so we have the fight side, if someone has gotten married because of meeting at your meetup, put your hands up high. So 5, 6, that's amazing. Okay, bravo. Say it again.
I just had two move in together.
2 people move in together, that counts. If you have met your spouse through Meetup, boy or partner, amazing. Beautiful, beautiful, amazing. If you have children, this has nothing to do with Meetup. Okay, wonderful. If you were born outside of the United States, stand up. So this is an interesting topic, and I want to, I'm just zip around and just, again, say how quickly as you possibly can. Name and city.
Sydney, Australia.
I know, Barcelona. Nikki, Bangalore, India.
I was born on an airplane coming from... The origin city is where you were born, so I was technically born in the Dominican Republic, even though I was in the air over the ocean.
That's amazing. Okay, you win, you win. Michelle, Brisbane.
Neha, Delhi, India.
Hong Kong, Hong Kong.
Shane, Dublin.
Beijing, China.
Steve, Toronto.
Ayo, Bridgetown, Barbados.
Barbados.
Clara, Bogota, Colombia. Nadine, Switzerland.
Okay, so just pause. We're halfway through the life of this group. Notice your attention, okay? Come back to the second half.
Andrew, Melbourne.
Sarah, born at home in a little village called Willing in Cambridgeshire.
Wow.
Madhu, Pune, India.
Robert, London. Victor, Harare, Zimbabwe.
I was born in Bulawayo. Yeah.
Jennifer, Montpellier, France.
Montpellier.
Yushin, Iran. Dawn, Vancouver.
Clara, Seoul, Korea.
Yolanda, Kokomo, Mexico.
Ahuva, Tel Aviv, Israel.
Wow.
Geraldine, Singapore. Amikuko, Matsudo, Japan.
Welcome.
Michael, West Bank.
Ian,
West Bank.
Toronto, Ian, Toronto.
Andrew, Montreal.
Stella, Moldova.
Okay. Yes.
Jesse, San Juan, Puerto Rico.
San Juan. So first of all, kudos to Meetup HQ for having such an incredibly widespread set of organizers. And the second thing I'll say is any type, and this is true for in any type of system, there is a center and there is a periphery. I'm going to say that again. In any type of system, in a family, in an organization, in a college, there's a center and a periphery. And those change depending on the context. Meetup is a New York-bound organization. It was founded after 9/11. Its roots matter. It happened because Scott, after 9/11, went out and realized that he, for the first time, was looking at his neighbors. It's an inherently New York company. And, wherever Fiona and other people are, it is also thinking about how to become inherently global and, interestingly, inherently native in different places. And so and that is true for any type of group. And each of your groups, no matter, even if you're 3 people, there is a center and there's a periphery. And that will change over time. The conscious organizer and the conscious host is aware of where that boundary lies because there's power in the periphery. You can see things. Cynicism, skepticism, not understanding why things work is actually very, very healthy in the life of groups when it's moderated. And there is a center, which is the core of the identity. So as you're thinking about how meetups work, and this is a 10 and 20 and 30-year conversation, to think about where and how, you all may not live there anymore. I understand there may be people who are hosting in different cities, to really listen and think about how are we inviting the conversations from the inside and the outside, and where do we want our centers to be. So that's true for Meetup, but it's also true for each of your groups. So thank you. If you still live in the city you were born in, if you still live in the city or town you were born in. Just stand up or raise your hands. Okay, so about a quarter, less, a fifth. Okay, so that's a great sub-question. So first let's say, if you stay standing if you've lived there your entire life. Okay, and let's just... Yeah, exactly. A day doesn't count. So let's just hear quickly the cities.
New York City. Brisbane. Delhi.
Where?
Long Island.
Toronto. New York City. New York. Brooklyn, New York.
Baltimore.
San Jose.
Melbourne.
Grand Rapids. Dallas, Texas.
Phoenix, Arizona.
Vancouver.
Very interesting. So the majority of you, Grand Rapids and Dallas, well, Dallas counts also, but the majority of you come from cities where the entire world exists in that city. They're metropolises, right? Delhi, 17 million people. New York, 11 million people. Phoenix is what size? So part of Meetup, so thank you, you can sit back down. How many of you have read this book? It just came out a couple of months ago called An American Marriage by Tahari Jones. It's a beautiful book, but the first line of that novel is, there are two types of people. Those who leave home and those who stay. And part of what Meetup is so interesting is that you're deciding wherever you are to create a sense of home, whether you've been there your entire life or whether you're moving into a new place. So I want to ask another question. How many of you set up a Meetup after moving to a new city? In part because of moving to a new city, perhaps. So just look around. How many of you set up your Meetup within the year after moving to a new city? So that's a very interesting data point. So part of, as you're thinking about meetups, particularly in your cities, is who are you creating community to? Because transplants tend to be the people who are looking for belonging. So I'm biracial. I grew up, as Scott referred to, half on my Iowan side, white American, and half Indian, in Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Botswana, in Indonesia, in India, in the Maldives, then in The Hague, then in Tucson, Arizona, and then in Virginia. And when I was 12 years old, my parents got divorced, and within 2 years, they were remarried. And my mother, Indian mother, had married a British Buddhist/atheist liberal guy, and my father had married a white American evangelical Christian Trump voting, where's Edward, woman. And they had joint custody. So I'm an only child, and every 2 weeks I'd go back and forth. And so it's no accident that I'm in the field of conflict resolution. And one of the reasons that I'm so interested in the creation of belonging is because both, personally, I've never felt that I fully belonged anywhere. But I also realized that if I think of myself as my Indian side, I belong more fully to my white family than anyone else who is Indian. And when I think about my Indian side, I belong more fully to that entire family than anyone else who is a white evangelical Christian from Iowa. And I am both. I inherit both. And part of what you're doing and the power of what you're doing, whether you realize it or not, whether you're a bold Betty, is that a name of a group? Where's my bold Betty? Or whether you're doing coding, or whether you're doing barbecue, or whether you're doing knitting, is you're starting to play in the life of groups, whether you've signed up for it or not. You're starting to host, and you're starting to hold something sacred. And as you think about activating your meetup groups, to become conscious of yourself as a facilitator, as a host, as a gatherer, will help, besides the confusion of, tell me your name again? Eric? Besides the confusion of place, which door you enter, it'll help also activate your engagement, and your attendance over the long term. So I want to actually now shift it a little bit and ask you all, what do you want to know of one another? So if you have a question for the group, who's in the room, come into the circle, so sort of take my role, and just ask a question of the group. What would you like to know? Yeah. Yeah, just say it loudly.
What's been the most gratifying experience thus far in like creating community?
Okay, so for the sake of this group, I'm going to ask you to rephrase your question into a question that people can identify with first. So if you have had an experience that has been deeply gratifying, raise your hand.
There we go.
Probably everybody. Okay, so this is good. So part of this is some of you run, how many people, who has humongous meetups? So when you have a meetup, there's more than 100 people there. Anyone more than 1,000 at the same time? Okay, so over 100. So part of, as you're growing, part of one of the skills is to know how do you ask a question that as many people in a large room can feel a part of and not be bored by the question, but not be so bombarded with the level of question. So work with me again. Think about asking this question in a way that gets interesting information out, but doesn't have the whole room raise their hand.
How many people have met that initial goal in creating your meetups?
So raise your hand if you've met your initial goal in creating your meetups. Okay, and now, so I want you to, one more time, even more specific, ask a question that you think will get a third of the room to raise their hand. And all of you be thinking about this also. How would you phrase a question for Eric that would get a third of the room, that would get interesting information out, that get interesting insight out from a group?
How many of you are completely satisfied with how your group has progressed?
Beautiful. Raise your hand. Okay, beautiful. So why was that an interesting question? Anybody?
It was absolute.
Say more.
It was completely satisfied. I could not honestly answer that with completely.
Beautiful. So when you're asking people to identify themselves in anything, absolutism, to borrow, tell me your name? Charity's word, is helpful. And gray area will get everybody confused. I asked one question earlier that said, are you an organizer? Was that what I asked? And someone said, do you mean a co-organizer or a main organizer? Right, there was ambivalence in my question. Ambivalence is okay. In fact, it can have space for deep creativity. But in a large group, it can be confusing. So one is, he said, completely satisfied. It was which allows you to decide whether I am or not. That's absolutely right. What else had power in his question? Why? Why was that question interesting? The goals may have changed over the life of the meetup. Absolutely. What else?
It was subjective.
It was. Yep, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to just keep zipping around. As you're listening to Eric, thank you. Ask questions of each other you want to know. It can be about Meetup, and it can just be about your identities, your interests, but and we'll do a rapid fire. So, floor is yours. Yeah, Ed.
Hey, this is Eddie Y from Vancouver once again. The question is, how many of you believe that your meetup group should be a completely non-profit group? Can I get a round of applause for these organizers?
Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
So first, kudos to the people who've been doing this 10 years. I wanted to find out, those who've been running meetups for a long time, how do you avoid burnout?
How do you avoid burnout?
How many of you have avoided burnout? Or are not burnt out after running it for many years?
So specific, after how many?
After 5 years.
So great. So you see how she changed her question dynamically? So how many of you have been running a meetup for more than 5 years who do not feel burnt out? Raise your hands high. This is a fascinating group full of knowledge. So can I call on you, Johnny? Tell us the secret. Tell us your secret.
My secret is just like a marriage.
We keep it interesting. We never get bored. If you keep doing the same thing over and over, you get burnout, you get bored. So we always bring new ideas, new people, and go from there.
Can you give a specific example of what you changed? What's your group?
Midwest Street Photography. We do street photography. Let me see. We started out doing street stuff, the homeless, and then we kind of started doing other stuff in the street. Just started shooting people in general. People do strange things in the street. I mean, you might catch two people over here doing something, and we shoot it.
Yeah, exactly. Do you have one also?
Well, I was going to say, I loved what you said because it made me think of how many people use jargon that's unfamiliar with who they're really trying to connect with. Because you said shot, right? In the street, which means somebody who's not familiar with photography, but they're interested, may not have an understanding of what your group truly stands for. So when you said that, the jargon, how many of us are using jargon that may turn off or propel potential prospects or people who are interested in becoming a part of our community?
Beautiful.
So thank you.
Beautiful.
Good looking.
So I want to say a couple things, Nina, right? So I want to say a couple of things about what Nina's saying. It's very, very, very important, which is about the language you use. There's the explicit language, and in any system, and I know Meetup HQ thinks about this all the time because every organization thinks about it all the time. What is the consistency that is tight enough so that it's actually a meetup? And how loose and broad and flexible do you allow people to express themselves into? And part of what Nina's talking about is language in terms of what is your name of your group and then what is the description of your group. And anytime an organizer, when you think about language, yes, you can have a literal name, so LGBTQ hikers with dogs. That's a group that I know about. But you can also have a name that is purposely vague and that the real reason is part of a shadow force. It might be something, and you may even be surprised by that reason. So a huge part of your decision as organizers is when do you allow your group to lead and when do you put a stake in the ground, right? And so this is true in every group. Right now, to talk on the left in the American context, there is a huge debate about whether or not pro-life women should be able to, speaking of a gathering, should be able to go to the Women's March. That is a huge boundary in left-right politics, in part because there are many Catholic women in the US who consider themselves left but are pro-life. And so in that case, some of the most dynamic conversations is where do we draw the line, regardless of what the fallout is. So in all of your groups, you will have that red line, and it might be whether your potatoes have butter in them or not. But there are some groups that are or barbecue sauce, barbecue. I mean, whether you use sauce or whether you don't, causes a lot of battles in a lot of places. But to think about, again, heat over time, where are your lines and when do you allow people to lead and when do you say, no, this is actually not what this is about? Okay, yes, tell us your name.
Lynn from Philly. I think that's very interesting because I started 4 groups, but only 2 were really, really active. And when I first started one group, someone said, well, I guess we're going to vote on that. And I'm like, I think we're over. And so, the genius of Meetup, and it's an interesting thing. It's a whole thing, direct democracy versus representative democracy.
Exactly.
But it's not a democracy.
Exactly.
It's not a dictatorship, but the beautiful thing is, if you don't like it, what you just outlined, those women could start a meetup for pro-life women.
Exactly.
Of a liberal background.
Exactly.
So that they can just do their thing.
Exactly. Beautiful. That's exactly, yeah. Tell us your name.
Stephanie. So I have a question.
Please.
How many of you feel that your meetups would be more effective if only equal to.
So the question was, how many people would think your meetup is more effective if only 5 or 10 people attended? Basically, if it was smaller in size is the assumption, right? Okay. And let's see, who hasn't spoken in the group yet of that? Yeah, tell us. No, let's follow up on this first. See, this is a benevolent dictatorship. Who raised their hand on that? Who has? Yeah, please, in the back.
So my name is Brittany, and I lead Nerdy 30s Ladies in Kansas City. So we skew very introverted. We skew antisocial / afraid of people. But we also skew on the Myers-Briggs, on the INFJ end of things, meaning like we like to go deep, but we're very, we need a safe space, and we need a small group of people that we feel close with to do that.
Beautiful.
So we do better with smaller, like under 12 is ideal.
Beautiful. And did you learn that? Tell me your name again. Brittany. Did you learn that through practice? Did you learn that through realizing that there's a bigger group and it didn't go as well?
No, the group grew organically and has gotten larger and larger. And actually, as the group has grown, I have a lot more organizers now and a lot more events now, so that we can spread out more, so that the events can still stay smaller, even though our core number keeps getting more.
Beautiful. Thank you. So tell me your name again, who asked the size question? Stephanie. So one of the things Stephanie is getting at is group size. And just a couple of rules of thumb. So groups of 6 tend to be very, very powerful for deep conversation. However, the drawback is it can't carry dead weight very well. So if there's 1 or 2 people who aren't really in it or for whatever reason aren't participating, 4 is not great. 8 to 12 is beautiful for a dialogue. So whenever I do much deeper dialogue, if I'm working with senior teams, I usually try to cap it between 8 or 12 because there's enough diversity of perspective if you've chosen it well, but you can also go deep because it can hold that amount of intimacy in a group. Groups of 30 are great for the buzz. So I sometimes do this masterclass with 30, and it's like enough energy for a group, but you can still go deep if people are conscious about participating. And above that is basically a party. And so if you have larger groups and you're trying to look for intimacy, a good rule of thumb is figuring out how to divide them into groups of 12 or groups of 6. And then thinking about people tapping into other participants or meetup participants to sort of sub-facilitate. A second thing is to think about how you can give people roles. So one of my favorite hosts is a woman named Nora Abu State. She's half German, half Egyptian. And she has created in the city something called Craft Jam, which is sort of getting together people to knit and to make things. And one of the things she does at her parties is she assigns everybody, particularly the introverts, at tables, the role of water minister. So she literally, just whenever she's hosting anybody, and it's just a small thing she does, she says, okay, you're the wine minister, you're the water minister. At a really good party, she says, you're the wine minister. But she gives people a nonverbal role to feel like they're cub-hosting, or sub-hosting, or co-hosting. And so thinking about ways you can draw people in ways that don't necessarily have to be so visual, and put them into a caretaking role. So one of the things to flip a dynamic as soon as you can in a group is moving people from consumer to producer, is moving people from thinking, oh my gosh, do I belong here, to how can I care for these people? How can I love on these people? Because all of a sudden it changes the dynamic very quickly. So another small little tip, Nora, she hosts a lot in her private life and in her public life. One of the things she does is at big, long tables of sometimes very formal gatherings, the food will come out, and rather than serving each person or having people, kind of devour the food themselves and try to get your, bowl and quickly as possible, she says, welcome to my home, or welcome to my company, or welcome to this conference. You're welcome to eat, but you have to be served by somebody else. You can only serve others food. And quickly, it just shifts. It's one tiny little tweak, but it completely shifts the dynamic of everybody at the table saying, oh my gosh, am I going to eat? Am I going to eat? Am I going to eat? Versus, let me serve you, let me serve you, let me serve you. And it radically changes the norms and the context. So let's get 2 more questions for the whole group, a new type of thing. Yeah, let's go here with Reese, and then in the back, yep. And then yeah, go ahead.
So how many people have made a fundamental change to their meetup group based on the feedback from one of your members?
Great question. And choose 2 people to elaborate. Raise your hands again.
How about you, sir? The lecture on.
And to say your name and group.
Andrew, and I mean, it's fundamental because we used to have 1 hour meeting, or 1 hour time writing sessions, which for me was great. And we chat beforehand, we write for an hour, and we chat afterwards. Some people couldn't handle that because a friend of mine said she gets just a bit antsy after about, so we switched to Pomodoros for 25-minute sessions, which for some people works less well. For me, it's okay, but at home I was an hour, so I'll be too distracted. I get 25 minutes of writing that, and then I'll clean the fridge. Whereas, you know, so that, it sounds superficial, but it makes a big difference.
Fundamental.
Because some people are just be scared to come.
Great. One other example. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, sure.
So
And to say your name and the group.
so my name's Alan. I'm from the Boston EdTech Meetup, and we used to always serve pizza, but we were having some people coming forward saying that they couldn't eat what we were serving. So we're now a nonprofit, and we wrote into our charter that we're not allowed to serve pizza more than twice a year. And as a result, we've started getting wholesale catering from the supermarket. It's actually really cost effective. It's only $3 per person. And now we have fruits and vegetables, and the quality of our food has gone up without increasing in price because we had to look for alternatives.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So one of the things, tell me your name again. Alan. So one of the things that Alan is talking about is, in a way, is how narrow do you go and what you include and exclude. So one of the insights I got from Scott when we spoke for my book is the power of specificity. And one of the things that he said that they learned at Meetup is that the more, at least at some point, the more adjectives a group would use in front of their name. So hikers versus LGBTQ hikers versus LGBTQ hikers with dogs, the more participation a group would get. So the more specific you were, the more you were able to be seen. But if you go too specific, you're excluding, no one will show, you'll have the, Eric? You'll have the Eric problem, no one will show up. So part of the band is how do we be specific so that we're seen, but not so specific that that no one can see themselves in here. Okay, yeah, last comment, and then, yeah, please.
How many of you have found that your meetups are increasingly disrupted by politics when they weren't before, since November 2016?
Asking for a friend? Just raise your hand, so if it's disrupted by politics or not. Interesting. Okay. So I want to do something that is dangerous in a crowd, but I'm going to do it, which is I'm going to invite you to pick up your bags and choose another seat in the room. And as you do, greet the people you pass. Okay. So raise your hand if you can hear me. The teachers in the room are like, I know that trick. Okay. So I'm going to now spend about 20 minutes talking you through a couple of different kind of principles, tips, as you think about hosting more explicitly, that I've learned that really, really, really help when you're starting to think about practicing for gatherings. Okay, so the first one, if you want to write it down, you're fine. But More of this is just principles of as you lead. So I alluded to this before, but when you think about the book is called The Art of Gathering, but it's really about the life of groups. And it's any time you're hosting a group, and this could be for your family, it can be in this context a meetup, it could be with your friends. All of these principles basically are the same because it's about the dynamism of systems when we're trying to do two things. So all group life is defined by two competing forces: the desire to belong and the desire to become. That is, Thomas Hübl is a German teacher who talks about this. So the desire to belong, to be part of the whole, and the desire to become, to be part of to be an individual. And as a host and as a gatherer, you're always basically hosting this dance. And part of the mistake that often groups make is that we think that groups are only defined by the we. But the most powerful groups have a very strong balance between the we and the I. Because if you're too strong on the we, that we are sisters, or we are a very specific type of well-being, mental and, what was the other word? Mental and emotional wellness. We are not talking about physical wellness. This is me, I'm not saying you're saying this, but we are not talking about physical wellness. We are not talking about spiritual wellness. That does not belong here. Whether she says that or not, these are different implicit choices that you're making of in any group. Who is the in-group and who is the out-group? And within the in-group, how much space do you allow for people to express parts that are different from the we? And the most powerful groups over time are able to basically hold a lot of I with a we that unites at some level. Another way to think about this is the writer, he's a systems thinker, Adam Kahane. It's a beautiful book for the where is my book clubs and what is the nerds? What was the name of the group again? Nerdy 30s Ladies. And where are my book clubs? Okay, book clubs. So another book that's fascinating, that's taught me some of the most about group life is called Power and Love by Adam Kahane. And it's basically, he's a facilitator, and this term power and love comes from the 1950s from a theologian named Paul Tillich. And he basically says that in all systems, in family, in companies and groups, there's these two competing forces, power and love. But he says you need both. And power without love is abusive. But love without power is anemic. And you need both. So as you're talking about, now you've all moved around, so I've lost my sense of gravity, but there was somebody who said at the first meeting, we said, like, let's all vote about this, and she said, actually, not really, right? So at any point in time, tell me your name again? Lynn. So at any point of time, you're basically constantly deciding as a host, where does decision power lie in this group? And where does it lie? And it might lie in different places at different times. And it might lie in ahead of the time. So some of you, one of you has culinary? Durham. So do you choose this place ahead of time? Yes. Have you ever had participants? So culinary, well, you tell it what it is. Maybe you all know. I think you presented yesterday, right?
Yeah, so culinary essentially is taking my friend who's, I consider him a dullard in terms of cuisine. He doesn't really know too much about the culinary world. I know a little bit. So I essentially take him out to explore and enjoy world cuisine and culture at the same time. And we, of course, invite people at Meetup to join us for these adventures.
And Durham? Durham. So Durham's entire premise starts with an expert-novice relationship. So how many of you in your groups have that dynamic? You're trying to teach something. Okay. So and how many of you have an exchange dynamic? It's premised on peers. Collaboration. Okay. How many of you have both? Okay. So part of this is having discernment as to when and how do you allow decisions to be made. The harder thing is when do you allow it to be made in the room, right? If somebody suggests something versus not, do you go with it? You have its agenda, somebody brings in another topic. Do you say, okay, this is relevant, or do you say, no? Who was standing down here? I think they moved again, and he wanted to ask a question, and I said, no, not right now. Yeah. And how did you feel when I said that?
like I wasn't listening to what you were asking from me.
So he could have felt, tell me your name again? Ross. So Ross could have felt a lot of different ways. He could have felt shut down. He could have felt like badly, like, oh, I wasn't listening, I made her look badly. Like there's 1,000 different things that could have happened in that little interaction. But it was witnessed by all of you. And I'm right now hosting you, but in all of your contexts, you're hosting each other, you're hosting your people. And so going back to this Durham point, right now he's in an expert-novice relationship where he makes group dynamic, where he makes the decision. The power of the decision is the choice of the restaurant and perhaps like what you order on that restaurant. Over time, he may decide that he wants to change the decision-making to have the novice research and choose a new place. Right? Even though it's about food, it's still fundamentally about power. And power defined simply as people having an ability to make a decision for other people. Okay? So one thing about all of group life is to just keep thinking the dance between the me and the we, and where and when and where do I want each? And to allow people to have a little bit more I than you're probably comfortable with. The best groups over time that last tend to have a little bit more I than people are comfortable with. So one of the ironies of cults, when you look at anthropology and sociology, is people who are inside cults define their experiences as the most individualistic they've ever felt. I feel like I found my place. I've never felt like I could be so free. I feel like I've been able to fully express myself. And so from the outside, it looks like they may be fully brainwashed, but on the inside, there's some dynamic where the I is actually very strong. There's a match between the I and the we. So that's just one thing to think about as a lens. A couple other things. One is we talked a lot about power, and one of the things that I think about is the idea of generous authority. So when Lynn said, you know, this is not a democracy, one of the things about organizers in the context of Meetup is to think about sort of how do you have authority in a generous way? How do you have authority for the purpose of the protection of your people? How do you have authority in a way that is generative, that allows allows chaos to come together for a specific moment of time and build something? And when you think about generous authority, there's kind of 3 things to keep in mind. The first is to protect your people. So Edward talked about the Australian, was that Edward? See, were you sleeping? Edward was talking about the Australian who, it turns out, was probably disrupting the room more than she was helping. And so if he's protecting his people in that context, it might actually be that the person needs to leave. So when you allow some disruption to go on and on and on and on, you're not protecting the rest of the group. So we tend to want to not be impolite if somebody takes us off track because we don't want to hurt them, but you're actually then leaving everyone else bereft. So one of the examples I love of this is the Alamo movie theater. Have any of you been to Alamo? The Alamo? So what is the rule in the Alamo? Does anyone know? Say it again? There's no... No talking. And what happens if someone talks? One warning and you get ejected. So every movie theater, at least in the US, says no talking. There's a cute little, animation that says no talking and everyone laughs. Alamo is the only one that actually enforces it. And it enforces it by giving one warning and then you actually are ejected. I've seen it happen before. And they're protecting their guests. So one of their commercials is a woman who was ejected in Austin, and she basically says, "You took my money, and you're not," and she's swearing the entire time. You assholes. And it's an actual message, and they took that message and they made it a commercial. It's like brilliant branding. But basically, what they're doing is saying, our purpose here is to bring the magic of the movies. When you are talking, so our North Star is our purpose, and we have legitimacy in kicking people out because you are blocking the purpose for everybody else. But they protect their guests because they do it in a way that no one else knows who the snitch is. No one else knows who gave them away because they have these cards that you can order food or drinks on, and it's the same card that you can write somebody's name down if they're using their phone. So it's a system that works, and they're consciously thinking about how they're protecting their guests. So don't be afraid to protect your guests. The second is to connect your guests. So find ways early on in the milling time to set the norm that people can talk to each other. particularly the introverts. Some of the best gatherers I know are introverted, and in part they use structure because they're so introverted. They know how to actually make people feel comfortable in that space. So connect, rather than thinking about your relationship as the one to the many, think about over the course of 2 hours or 3 hours, making the relationship from the many to the many. And the third is to equalize your guests. Make them equal. Figure out whether even in your mentoring dynamics, figure out ways that you can flip the dynamic so that when there's one person teaching another, perhaps at the end, you figure out what does that person know that this other person doesn't know. Because over time, equality also is very, very resonant. And it starts becoming a marketplace rather than a cathedral. And then the last thing I'll say is when you think about, so 2 other dynamics, and then I'm going to have you actually choose somebody next to you, which is groups are very powerful when 2 things happen. One is there's an intimacy shared, there's a vulnerability shared. This happened, well, let me ask you, over the last 2 hours, when are moments where somebody took a risk and the collective intimacy increased?
Stephanie.
And what happened?
She expressed some events that happened in her group involving mental health, opening herself up and sharing her own experience.
Beautiful.
So
a couple of things happened when, you're absolutely right, when Stephanie spoke. One is you found out really interesting information about her group. But the second is she continued to use I. She didn't say this group is about that and they, or even, she didn't even say we. She kept saying I, and she kept coming back to herself. And in that, it gave an implicit permission of what else, to everybody else, implicitly or explicitly, wow, what would I share here? Wow, I really trust her. Wow, what is it that she just allowed? She just opened up a space, or a space, I use the word taboo, but a space that allows for the expansion of the possibility of what we could talk about. When else in the last 2 hours did our collective intimacy go up? Please.
When we talked about people not showing up, and when Eric shared specifically about that.
And why did that, tell us your name? Andrew. And why did that increase our intimacy?
Because there may be like an insecurity we would have about the size of our groups, and so to hear somebody else say, hey, I've been there, I've done that, allows us to be vulnerable with that ourselves.
Absolutely.
when we all switch seats and welcome each other.
Interesting. Why? What happened?
It's just a chance to kind of get out of ourselves and start touching each other, shaking hands. Oh, have a nice seat. Let's reset.
Exactly. Absolutely. And Reese, right? Ross. I had a Reese yesterday. Ross brings up a very interesting point, which is your ability, and this is underused, to physically think about the physical construction of your group. Are people sitting in a circle? How are you setting up? A lot of meetup organizers use public spaces, so you're not controlling what the setup is. But to think about how can you sit in a circle, how can you move people's perspectives. In conflict resolution, one of the things that we do when a group gets really, really, really stuck is we actually ask them to shift seats, and we don't tell them that we don't make a big deal of it. We just say, after the break, let's just move a few seats, and the conversation always changes. So the physical experience also makes us think differently, makes us see differently. So the second thing that allows for sticky groups and groups that are exciting, frankly, to be at is heat. Heat can be conflict, it can be taboo, it can be risk, it can be anything that people tend to avoid for good reasons or not good reasons. So when in the last 2 hours were there moments where heat was injected? There's a couple of very interesting moments. When did heat get injected? Absolutely. So literal fights. And I don't know if you noticed the physical room when, so there was Edward, and then there was, what was the Hawaii? Where's the Hawaii host? Yes, tell me your name again. Lilia. When Lilia spoke, it was like a wave watching you. Everybody leaned in. Like the group changed. You know, we just, it's like gossip heat, all this stuff. And you need to be careful of it because it's also dangerous. But when there's heat in a room, it becomes sticky. There's another moment that was very interesting that when heat was introduced. It was in a question somebody asked.
I just remember when you said, say your name and how long it took you to get here, and people went off the track, and then you corrected them, and I just felt this sudden change in the whole dynamics, because now everybody's thinking about, did I make a mistake? What am I going to say next? That was very interesting.
Beautiful. And you want to be careful with this. I'll come to you next. Because you want to be careful about putting people on the spot. And you're a sophisticated group, you are organizers, and so I pushed earlier on than I normally would. But yes, so one of the things I did was I named. I paused and I named what was going on. So if and when something's happening in your group, one of the best things you can do, rather than trying to fix it or flee it, is to just name it. So, and it could even be through a question. So what do we think is happening here? Let's just pause for a second. So I hear that, so Andre is bringing up the idea that the way we serve food is not inclusive. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but the power of naming is one of the most underused part of facilitating any group, to name what is there without making it wrong or right. There was one more moment of heat I want to just bring up. Does anyone, yeah?
Yeah, and I can't remember his name, I'm sorry, but when he asked how many organizers think Meetup should be free forever, or their Meetup.
Beautiful, beautiful. So who asked that question? Beautiful.
We were talking about drinks last night.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So from my perspective, and I always argue in a friendly way with clients about this, is in any system, there's going to be a center, there's the public square, and there's the corridors. Healthy groups have a channel between the corridors, the bar, and the center. So Ed felt comfortable enough to bring in quite a controversial topic. It's been a controversial one for years. He named something, and naming does not mean changing it. It allows for emotion and perspective to be released, and you may learn from it. So it's a beautiful way to safely bring in heat, is to talk about the things, particularly as a host, that you are avoiding, but within some amount of structure. So yes, it can go into a riot or a chaos or different elements, but to allow yourself to play a little bit with what the taboos in the group are and allow to think about how do you create a safe space for it. And then the last thing I'll talk about, and then I think I'm out of time, are openings and closings. So the way you open a gathering really, 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 really matters. And the way you close a gathering really, really, really matters. So memory experts look at the life of a talk, and they look at an audience, and they see that the first 5% and the last 5% of an experience are when people's attention are the highest. And what do we usually do to open and close a gathering? Conferences, meetings. We do logistics. We tend to, even before the icebreaker, even before almost anything else, if you start noticing, we tend to start and end with logistics. And it is terrible. You need to do logistics, but you do them as the second and the second to last. So I was recently at a funeral. This is like a true story. I was at a funeral that started with logistics. We went, actually it was for my mentor, we went, and there was like 300 people in the room, people who hadn't seen each other in a long time, we're sort of like pregnant with emotion, already, about to cry, some of us already crying. Minister gets on the stage, and he takes a deep breath, and we all take a deep breath, and he says, now before I begin, I just want to let you know that actually there's not enough parking in the rec center, so if you could just walk over, I kid you not, if you could just walk over afterwards, we would really appreciate it. Now we can begin. And it's such an extreme example, but 99% of us do that, including myself. And so when you think about your groups, think about as they enter, first, what are you doing in the milling around time? Don't be on your phone, don't be setting things up. Literally, even if the food isn't ready, just drop it and host. Welcome people. Welcome them, welcome them, welcome them. In different ways. And the second is, don't end on logistics. So even if you forget, begin on purpose and end on purpose. And it can be embodied, and it doesn't have to be literal. We don't have to say the purpose of this group is to blah, 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 blah. It can be something, it can be like for the hiking group, it could be starting with stretches. And then once people are stretched and warmed up, then you go over some logistics. It can be done in a lot of different ways. But think creatively about how you want to open in a way that connects people to you. So how did I open this? What did I do?
Establish trust.
How did I establish trust? And what did I literally do? What did you all do? What did we do in the opening? Stood up, stretch. Actually, yeah, Carolyn had you stretch, but when I did. Breathe. What else? Ground yourself. Close your eyes. I asked for consent. Yep. And that, tell me your name again? Charity. That was the riskiest thing I did that also had logic. When I said, breathe and see each other. It was the riskiest thing that I did. You should have seen the looks you all were giving me. But it also had logic. Because when you're hosting, you're constantly saying, where am I and where are my people? Am I taking care of them and am I here? And it's very hard to do both at the same time. So I try to embody what I'm asking you all to do. So we're getting close to the end. I'm not going to end on logistics. This is the third to last thing we're going to do, and that is a gift. And it's my pleasure to have Meetup. One of the reasons we said not to take notes is because Meetup decided to gift you all the art of gathering. And these are actually, these came off the press yesterday, so they're actually not even on the bookshelf yet. Okay, so we're going to try an interesting exercise, which is, can we receive without talking right now? Much of what we did today are on these pages. And say it again. And actually, Riverhead, my publisher, made a very, very unique. They basically got like 7 permissions to get these books to you because Meetup really wanted you all to have them, and they're not on the shelves until May 15th. And so there were a lot of lawyers who decided, yes, you all are like literally the match for the principles in this. And what I'll say is, as you read it, as you engage with it, to really think about your role as a gatherer. And as every time you're with a group, and yes, in this context it's Meetup, but this is as true with your family, it's as true with your friends, that whenever you're hosting and whenever you're understanding group life, to think about how can you both embody what it is you're trying to create in others, but how do you create an experience that is intentional and connects people around whatever it is that you're doing. And as you think about closing, so one of the things, again, if we're kind of reverse engineering, one of the things that this kind of book moment is what I call the last call of the gathering. So at bars, bars have a last call when literally they say last call, and you get the person's number, or you just get your courage up, or you have the last beer, or you pay your bill. So one of the things about gatherings, and particularly at the end, is you do all of this stuff to kind of like make it good, and whether it's a dinner party or whether it's a meetup, and then at the end, the time is up, it's hit 4 o'clock or it's hit 6 o'clock, and you think, okay, we're done, let me make a couple of announcements, like great to have you, bye. It's actually a waste of all that has happened before us, because people need time to remember and to process what has happened before, as well as they're going to remember the last thing that you actually did. And so a last call is a way to begin to signal we're starting to wind up, but not necessarily ending. It's in and of itself. And as I think about, let me say a couple of things. As I think about your all's last calls, think about how you can make last calls and your own closings in a way that your group creates the closings. So the last few moments of any type of experience the group is ripe to build and identify with the tribe you've created. And one of the problems with gatherings is they stop, they don't end. And so I invite you to think about how you want to end your gatherings. So did any of you end in a specific way?
We do.
Please tell me your name.
I'm Janita with Outdoor Afro, and we end all our events with a closing circle. We do an opening circle and then a closing circle, and the closing circle always ends with one word to describe how you feel at that moment, and then we end it, and that's it.
Beautiful. And how do you feel right now?
Inspired.
Great. Other endings, and tell us your name, Nina.
We actually speak a blessing over each other's life as we part from each other.
Beautiful.
So,
And your name.
Jeff with Kayak
And speak up.
Jeff with Kayak Adventures. And so I remind people to post their photos up on Meetup, and then I also remind them of the upcoming events so that they know what to sign up for next.
Okay. So I would reverse the order of that. end with, what was the first thing you do?
We asked to post the photos of the events.
Post the photos of the events and what is up next. So if you can, flip the order. And yoga teachers, this is true in every gathering. Once you think about this, you'll start laughing when you're at gatherings. Yoga teachers do this. How many of you have been to a yoga class? So at the end, Shavasana, everyone's lying down usually. They come up, you're in this the whole point is to be in the Zen space. Some teachers end with an Om or a Namaste. You open your eyes and you have a few minutes. And then many teachers go into community announcements, or they announce their next workshop. And it is a terrible way to actually end a class that is trying to get you to reconnect with yourself. So we don't even think about the way we end. So they need to be creative, because you don't want to do it during the yoga class, but don't do it at the end. Because all of the time that people are in front of you counts. The before the opening and the after the closing is all still part of the gathering. A couple more examples of how you close? Yeah, in the back. And say your name.
I tell them there's always room at the table, and I tell them I hope we'll see them again, and we shake hands and hug everybody through the lens.
Beautiful.
My group ends with a musical blessing in the form of either Amazing Grace or Down by the Riverside.
Wow. Can you come to all of our meetups? Others?
Typically, I'll ask someone that's the first or second time to share maybe their favorite thing that they learned or person that they met. And then I always make sure, hey guys, don't forget I'm available. If you need anything, call me, give me a phone number, and I just let it naturally progress.
Beautiful. He cares for them. A couple more. Yeah, Bree, and then we'll go around.
I just encourage everybody, if they hadn't already in the course of the meetup, to make sure they make a friend before they leave.
Beautiful. So she's changing also the norms. She's giving permission by actually saying, hey, meet people. You'd be shocked at how much something can change. It's like the Nora thing of you can eat, but only if you serve other people. How much just a simple prompt can change the dynamics, because everybody's wondering, how can I be here? How am I supposed to be here? So a couple of things. One is definitely end your gathering, your meetup. You can then have an after party, but that's a new opening. So don't let your meetup fizzle out or bleed out. End it. And then allow people to do whatever, to have a life of its own. So I want to invite you to, you had your hand up for a while, please.
One of the things that we do, because it's a women's networking group, is that we encourage authentic relationships. So we pass our business cards back out. You pick someone else's business card, that's someone that we ask you to meet with offline at another time, just to get to know each other. There's no selling allowed.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Tell me your name again. Jean. So one of the things Jean is talking about is actually interstitching between groups, between the life of a group. So also thinking about what are you asking people to do between groups. Sometimes it could be, a meetup shirt or some other symbol or a business card that reminds people of the memory of what happened. And so thinking about symbols or artifacts that they take from it. It could, if you're knitting, it could be the thing that you're actually knitting. But symbols or artifacts that allow the memory and the interaction to continue between groups. So I invite you to stand back up. And the second to last thing we're going to do is logistics. My understanding is you now all have a break, and you'll meet back up where at 4:30? Here at 4:30. Any other logistics? Meetup team? No. Okay. Oh. Okay. So we're going to end the way we begin, which is I'm going to invite you to just put your hands by your side. Okay, take a couple of deep breaths. And if you'd like, you can close your eyes and think back to, you started with this moment in your meetup group where you felt, this is why I do this. And perhaps feel grateful for that. And feel energized. And just notice one of the ways one of your fellow organizers ends is by asking each person in one word what they're feeling. So I'm going to invite you to do that now, just in your own mind's eye. Just check in. How are you feeling? and can take another couple of deep breaths and begin to just open your eyes. And to look around and just notice who you see. Continue to breathe. And all of the different words that we heard over the last 2 hours, the places people come from homes and being born in homes to the West Bank, to Japan, from meetups that began with a drizzle and existed in a hurricane, to fights that broke out over politics and trivia questions, to the various subway lines you each took to get here, as well as 2 women who both came from Vancouver, and one took 5 hours and the other took 7. To thinking about how you want to name your groups and what your charters are, whether or not to allow pizza to be in your constitution. And to think about what do you do and to be curious when people don't show up. To ask one another, how are you avoiding burnout? To think about what is inherently interesting in your group. Street photography is inherently dynamic because the content of your group inherently changes by definition, whereas other groups are stagnant and you need to think about how to introduce different experiences. And finally, to seeing one another and all of the various questions that you allow, from the heat that is brought in, about asking about taboo subjects of whether it should be paid or not paid, whether you're frustrated with the Meetup platform or not frustrated with the Meetup platform. In this context, Meetup is your host, but in most contexts, you are the hosts. And so as you depart, as you go to your break, to think about how can you, as you gather, bring in heat and intimacy, to open and close with purpose, and to allow all of the people that you host and bring together to both be, do, and be seen. And I thank you.